Cristiano Ronaldo once said that Roy Keane was the most influential teammate he ever played with, more than Karim Benzema, more than Sergio Ramos, more than any of the Galacticos at Real Madrid. This is a man who shared dressing rooms with some of the greatest players in football history, yet he points to a combative Irish midfielder who never scored more than 9 league goals in a season. That tells you something isn't quite right with the way we remember Roy Keane. We think of the tackles, the red cards, the snarling face, but the players who actually stepped onto the pitch with him remember something far more unsettling. They remember a man who weaponized perfectionism, who turned training sessions into psychological examinations, who could make you feel worthless with a single glance. The question we need to answer is this: what separates fear from respect, and did Roy Keane understand that line better than anyone else in football? We'll come back to that, but first, you need to understand what playing alongside Roy Keane actually meant. This video isn't about whether Roy Keane was a great player, because that's already settled. This is about how one man turned intensity into a tactical weapon that terrified even his own teammates. That's the tension at the heart of Keane's legacy. The people who should have felt safest around him were often the most afraid. When Roy Keane arrived at Manchester United from Nottingham Forest in 1993 for a British record fee of £3.75 million, he wasn't supposed to be the enforcer. He was Brian Robson's replacement, brought in for his driving runs from midfield, his ability to arrive late in the box, his engine that never stopped. But Alex Ferguson saw something else, something that would prove far more valuable than goals or assists. He saw a player whose standards were so uncompromising that they bordered on pathological, and Ferguson recognised that kind of madness could be harnessed. Within 2 years, Keane wasn't just playing for Manchester United, he was the spiritual embodiment of everything Ferguson wanted the club to represent. The manager had found his extension on the pitch, except Keane took the demands for perfection even further than Ferguson did. Where Ferguson might accept a win with a flawed performance, Keane never could. He needed domination, total and complete, and he needed everyone around him to want it just as badly. That's where the fear started. Rio Ferdinand has told the story dozens of times, and it never gets less remarkable. He said that during training sessions at Manchester United, he was more afraid of misplacing a pass than he ever was during actual matches. Think about that for a moment. Rio Ferdinand, one of the most naturally gifted defenders English football has ever produced, a player who would go on to make over 80 appearances for England, was terrified of making a mistake in training. Not because he'd get dropped, not because Ferguson would yell at him, but because Roy Keane would look at him. Ferdinand described it as a withering stare that made you feel like you'd betrayed not just the team, but some fundamental code of human decency. Keane didn't need to shout, didn't need to throw his arms up in frustration. The look was enough. It communicated everything: disappointment, disgust, and a withdrawal of respect that cut deeper than any verbal tirade. Ferdinand said he would go home after training sessions and replay every pass he'd made, analysing whether any of them had been slightly underhit or overhit, because he couldn't bear the thought of Keane questioning his commitment. This wasn't a teammate pushing for excellence, this was psychological conditioning. Keane had created an environment where the fear of his disapproval became a more powerful motivator than any coaching instruction or tactical briefing. And it worked. Manchester United's training sessions under Keane's captaincy became notorious for their intensity, with players treating practice matches like cup finals because anything less would invite his judgment. But Keane's methods weren't just about creating fear, they were about establishing a hierarchy of commitment. He had a very specific worldview. Football was everything, and if you treated it as anything less, you were weak. This wasn't the usual platitude about giving the 110% that every manager trots out before a match. Keane genuinely believed that any player not operating at maximum capacity, physically and mentally, for every single second of training and matches, was committing an act of betrayal. When Keane talked about players not being good enough, he rarely meant talent, he meant character. He could tolerate a missed chance or a misplaced pass if he believed the player was genuinely trying. What he couldn't tolerate was perceived coasting, and his definition of coasting was far stricter than anyone else's. A player jogging when they should be sprinting, a player not tracking back with full intensity, a player laughing after a training session where mistakes had been made. These were capital offences in Keane's world. Gary Neville once said that Keane would rather play alongside a less talented player who gave everything than a brilliant player who only gave 95%. The problem was that Keane's judgment of what constituted full effort was entirely subjective and often seemed impossible to meet. Players described feeling like they were constantly being assessed, constantly being measured against a standard that Keane himself had set, but never fully explained. The famous tunnel incident with Patrick Vieira before the match between Arsenal and Manchester United in Maastricht. February 2005 shows how Keane's intensity could turn pre-match rituals into warfare. The two teams were in the tunnel at Highbury and Vieira began talking to Gary Neville, apparently upset about a tackle Neville had made on Jose Antonio Reyes in a previous match. Keane immediately stepped in, getting right in Vieira's face and telling him to pick on someone his own size. The footage is remarkable, not because of what Keane says, which is mostly inaudible, but because of how he says it. While everyone else in the tunnel looks uncomfortable, uncertain how to handle the confrontation, Keane is absolutely calm. His eyes never leave Vieira's face, his body language is relaxed, and his voice, from what players later reported, never rises above conversational volume. This is the ice-cold calculation that made Keane truly terrifying. He wasn't losing his temper, he was choosing confrontation as a tactical tool. He wanted Vieira rattled before the match even started, wanted Arsenal's captain thinking about him instead of the game. More than that, he wanted his own teammates to see that he would walk through fire for them, that he would confront anyone, anywhere, if he felt the team was being disrespected. It was psychological warfare conducted with surgical precision. Arsenal lost that match 4-2, and Vieira, for all his own considerable toughness, was noticeably subdued. Keane had won the battle before a ball was kicked. This brings us to something crucial about understanding Keane's impact. He was never out of control, even when he appeared to be. The red cards, the angry outbursts, the confrontations, they all served a purpose. When Keane was sent off for stamping on Gareth Southgate during a 1995 match, it looked like a moment of madness. But Keane later admitted he'd made a conscious decision that Southgate needed to be intimidated. When he admitted in his autobiography to deliberately injuring Alf-Inge Haaland in 2001, a tackle that earned him a 3-match ban, which was later extended to 5 matches and a £150,000 fine. After the book's publication, he framed it as settling a score from a previous incident where Haaland had accused him of faking injury. We can debate the morality of that action, and most would rightly condemn it, but we can't ignore the cold calculation behind it. Keane didn't do things in the heat of the moment. He decided to do them and then executed those decisions. That's a different kind of dangerous. It meant that opponents could never assume his aggression would lead to mistakes, could never bait him into doing something stupid that would help their team. Everything Keane did, even the things that got him punished, happened because he decided they were worth doing. The players who loved Keane, and there were many, loved him because they knew he applied the same impossible standards to himself. He wasn't a hypocrite demanding things from others that he wouldn't do. Dennis Irwin, who played alongside Keane for years at Manchester United, said he never once saw Keane coast through a training session or fail to track back during a match. When Keane's body started to fail him in his final years at United, when hips and knee problems meant he couldn't cover the ground he once had, he was visibly frustrated with himself. In his final season before his acrimonious departure in November 2005, teammates said Keane was harder on himself than on anyone else, furious that his body wouldn't do what his mind demanded. This self-flagellation made his criticism of others easier to accept for some players. They knew it wasn't personal cruelty, it was a worldview where anything less than perfection was unacceptable from anyone, including himself. But that didn't make it less frightening. If anything, knowing that Keane would never lower his standards, never accept excuses, never forgive what he saw as weakness, made him more intimidating. There was no reasoning with him, no explaining that you'd had a bad day, or weren't feeling well. The only acceptable response to criticism from Keane was to be better next time. Cristiano Ronaldo arrived at Manchester United in 2003 as an 18-year-old winger with extraordinary talent and a tendency to overcomplicate things. He's talked about how Keane transformed him from a showboating teenager into a complete player. Ronaldo said that Keane never praised him, not once in their time together, but that Keane's expectations forced him to improve. In one training session, Ronaldo attempted an elaborate piece of skill that didn't come off, and Keane apparently asked him why he was trying to be a circus act instead of a footballer. It stung, Ronaldo admitted, but it also made him realise that all the step-overs in the world meant nothing if he wasn't contributing to the team winning. What's remarkable is that Ronaldo, who became arguably the most driven and self-demanding player of his generation, credits Keane with teaching him that mentality. It's like Keane passed on a virus of perfectionism, and it infected one of the few players whose natural ability could match the standards Keane demanded. Ronaldo also said something else that's revealing. He said that once you earned Keane's respect, once he believed you were genuinely committed, the fear didn't disappear, but it changed into something else. It became a fear of letting him down rather than a fear of him personally. That distinction might seem small, but it's everything. It meant that Keane's method, as brutal as it was, actually created loyalty among those who survived it. But not everyone survived it. There are players who left Manchester United during Keane's captaincy who have said off the record that the environment became toxic. They felt that Keane's standards were impossible and that the constant psychological pressure made them worse players, not better. They described feeling paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes, so worried about Keane's reaction that they couldn't play with freedom or creativity. This is the dark side of his approach, the collateral damage of using fear as motivation. For every Ronaldo who thrived under that pressure, there might have been several players whose confidence was shattered. Ferguson eventually decided that Keane's influence had become problematic. In November 2005, after Keane gave an interview to MUTV that was so critical of his teammates that the club refused to broadcast it, Ferguson terminated his contract. The official story was that Keane had criticised players publicly, but insiders suggested Ferguson had realised that Keane's methods were no longer building the team up, they were tearing it apart. The game was changing, younger players were different, and Keane's uncompromising approach was alienating rather than inspiring them. What's fascinating is how Keane's terrifying intensity translated, or failed to translate, into management. He took over at Sunderland in 2006 and led them to promotion from the Championship, but his time there and his subsequent spell at Ipswich Town revealed the limitations of his approach. He couldn't create the same fear as a manager that he'd had as a player sharing the dressing room. Players could go home, could avoid him in ways they couldn't when he was standing next to them on the pitch. The psychological weapon that had been so effective when he was a teammate became less sharp from the manager's office. His managerial career never reached the heights his playing career did, and part of that has to be because the very thing that made him exceptional as a player, that ability to impose his will through sheer force of personality in close quarters, doesn't work the same way when you're not in the trenches together. The other captains of that era, people like Vieira, John Terry, Steven Gerrard, they demanded high standards too, but there's a reason Keane is the one who inspires these kinds of stories. Vieira was intense but approachable. Terry was demanding but encouraging. Gerrard led by example but didn't psychologically dissect his teammates. Keane was different. He used fear deliberately and systematically. He understood that in a team sport, controlling the emotional environment could be as important as tactical preparation. If he could make his teammates more afraid of his disapproval than they were of the opposition, he could push performance levels beyond what coaching alone could achieve. It's a method that probably wouldn't work in modern football, where sports psychologists monitor mental health and players have more power relative to senior teammates. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, when dressing room hierarchies were more rigid and younger players were expected to defer to senior pros, Keane's approach was devastatingly effective. There's a broader question here about leadership and whether fear can ever be a sustainable tool for motivation. In the short term, it clearly works. Manchester United won 7 Premier League titles, 4 FA Cups and the Champions League during Keane's time at the club, and he was captain for most of the successful period. Those teams were mentally unbreakable, capable of winning matches in the final minutes because they refused to accept anything but victory. That mentality came from Keane, but the long-term cost might be harder to measure. How many players developed anxiety issues? How many had their love for the game diminished by the constant pressure? How many talented youngsters never reached their potential because they couldn't handle the psychological warfare? We don't have those answers because those players don't tell those stories, at least not publicly. What we have instead are the testimonies of the survivors, the ones who made it through and became champions, and their accounts are complicated. They describe fear and respect, terror and gratitude, often in the same breath. So what's the final verdict on Roy Keane's methods? Here's what we know for certain. He made good players better by refusing to let them be comfortable. He created an environment where complacency was impossible because someone was always watching, always judging, always demanding more. He turned Manchester United's dressing room into a place where only the mentally strongest could thrive. And in doing so, he helped build one of the most successful teams in English football history. But he also created casualties, players who couldn't meet his standards and were discarded or diminished by the experience. The question isn't whether Keane was effective, because the trophy cabinet answers that. The question is whether the cost was worth it, and whether that kind of leadership built on fear and uncompromising demands has a place in modern football or any workplace. Different people will answer that differently depending on their values. Some will say that greatness requires sacrifice, and that Keane's methods, harsh as they were, produced results that justified them. Others will argue that fear-based leadership is inherently toxic, and that success achieved that way is tainted by the psychological damage left behind. But here's what makes Keane's story so compelling. He never pretended to be anything other than what he was. He didn't try to be liked, didn't soften his edges for public consumption, didn't apologize for his intensity except when he crossed legal or ethical lines. In an era where athletes are increasingly managed by PR teams and taught to say the right things, Keane was authentically himself, for better and worse. The fear he inspired wasn't accidental or a side effect of his personality, it was the point. He believed that fear of failure, fear of letting down your teammates, fear of not being good enough, these were essential ingredients in the recipe for success. And for him, surrounded by players who could handle that pressure and channel it into performance, it worked. Whether it should have worked, whether it was right that it worked, those are different questions entirely. This brings us back to where we started, the line between fear and respect. Roy Keane didn't just walk that line, he erased it. For the players who survived his captaincy, the two became inseparable. They feared him because they respected him, and they respected him because they feared disappointing him. It's a psychological knot that doesn't untie easily, and it explains why, 20 years after he left Manchester United, players still tell these stories with a mixture of reverence and relief. They're proud to have played with him and grateful they don't have to anymore. That paradox is Roy Keane's legacy. He was the teammate everyone needed and nobody wanted, the captain who made you better by making you terrified of being worse, the leader whose greatest weapon wasn't his tackling or his passing, but his ability to make you believe that anything less than your absolute best was a betrayal of everything football should be. And if you're a Manchester United fan watching this and you've never truly understood what made those teams so mentally unbreakable, now you know. They had a captain who scared them more than any opponent ever could, and that fear forged them into champions. If you want more deep dives into the psychological warfare and untold stories that shaped football's greatest eras, you need to subscribe to Once Legends right now, because we're just getting started on revealing the truth behind the legends you thought you knew. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that changes how you see the game. Now here's my question for you. If you were a young player at Manchester United during Keane's captaincy, would you have thrived under that pressure or been broken by it? And honestly, how do you know?